In this video, we're going to learn to take input from the user and apply it to a new user parameter. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video we're going to carry on with our API series, and we're going to talk about getting input from the user and different ways in which we can use things like the units manager to help evaluate our expressions. So first, what we want to do is we want to talk about what we've done already and what we're missing. So at this point, we've learned how to gather information from a pre-existing user parameter, and we've done that by using item by name. We knew that we had one called length, and we were able to spit out things like the expression or the comments very easily. Then we learned how to create a new user parameter, but we had to be very careful with the actual value of the units. We had to do some work in order to convert or use the value input functionality to make sure that the value is in the right format. And then we also saw that we had to deal with conversion issues because centimeters are used in the back end of Fusion in general, and we're really looking at getting a value in millimeters. So what I want to do in this case is I want to start a new program, and I want to learn how to use some of that functionality that's already built in for us so we don't have to repeat it. So we're going to create a new user parameter script. We're going to call this one API again, just so it sticks at the top of our list. And I'm going to call this get input and UP for user parameter, and we'll create that. Then we'll go into edit. Again, I'm going to trust the author. I know I can just accept that by default, but this kind of helps me, just reminds me that I shouldn't just accept them by default. So again, we're going to just use this default program, and I'm going to start by, again, going to design equals, and remember that this is going to be adsk.fusion.design, and that's going to be .cast, and then we're going to do app.activeProduct. So just repeating that process over and over again reminds us that we are creating that design variable and we're bringing in information from the design that helps us gather and collect and use some of this functionality. Before we worry too much about using the units manager, which I'll talk about in just a little bit, I want to first talk about how we can actually get input from the user. Now, we all know that in Fusion we have dialog boxes, and those dialog boxes pop up on the right-hand side of the screen by default, and we can manipulate them various ways. What we can do is we have sliders or we have toggles, and we can manually enter values. We're not quite to that point. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about just popping up a dialog that allows us to have some input. So in order to do that, what I want to do is first I need to create a variable that can store whatever the user gives us back. So we know that UI.messageBox will create a message box that pops up for the user. So what we're going to do is create a value or a variable to hold whatever the user returns. So we're going to call this new input, and we're going to set that equal to UI dot and start typing input. And notice that there is an input box here. Once we start the brackets, you can see exactly the information it's looking for. Now we're going to talk about each piece of information here. So the first piece is the prompt. Now this is what is going to be displayed to the user. So what I'm going to tell them to do is I'm going to say, enter a new input value. So pretty, pretty generic. And then if we move along to the next one, this is the title. Now at this point, we actually don't need to fill in anything else, but we can change the title. So in this case, what I'm going to do is, again, using quotes because it's a string, the title for the box is going to be new input value. So that'll pop up at the top. And then the next argument is the default value. Now we can manually enter a value here, but it's probably better for us to create a variable. Since we don't have one, I'm just going to name it default input. And then I'm going to go back and create that. So it's got lines underneath it because it doesn't actually exist, but we'll fix that in a second. So that's the last bit it needs. And then notice that the return is something called a tuple. Now, what this actually is it's something that can store multiple values. It returns a value in the case of a string. This is what the user sends back. And then there's this bool. It's a Boolean value. And you can see here that if we go through the list, that the default value is the string that's going to show when the dialog is displayed, and it returns a string entered by the user. But because the user is able to click cancel, the cancel argument should be tested before. And that cancel argument is this true false that comes back, that Boolean value. So now let's go back and let's fix this default input. And we're going to go just one line above, default input. And this is going to be equal to some value. In our case, let's just say 5, and I'm going to put millimeters after it. Now, because this is a mix of values, we have a number and a unit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put that in quotes to turn it into a string, because what's going to end up happening is this string is going to be the default input string that the user has. And we're going to talk about ways in which we can convert that to a number. But at this point, let's go ahead and change this hello script. We're going to get rid of our quotes, and we're going to put new input here. So that new input variable is the one that we created. So let's go ahead and save this and just see what happens. So back in Fusion 360, we're going to go to our add-ins, and this is going to be get input up. So you can see here, now we have new input value. That was the title we gave it. Enter a new input value. That's the string that we said, which was the user prompt. And 5 millimeters is automatically in here. So we can change this. We could say 50 millimeters and okay. But notice here, now we're getting an issue. We can't display it instantly because it's looking for different values. So you can see that we have a string and a constant. These are two values, string and constant. And what this is telling us is that we can't simply just spit back the same value. Part of the reason we're having this issue is because this variable is not just a string. It's that tuple. It's got a string and it's got a Boolean value in it. So what we need to do is we need to create square brackets and we need to put a 0. And the reason we do that is because the string is the first item inside of there and the Boolean, the true false, is the second. So now let's save this and let's try again. So back in Fusion 360, we're going to go to our get user input or get input up. We're going to leave it at 5 millimeter and now we get that back. So let's test it again. Let's see if we can get it to change values. So we're going to say 50 millimeters and we get 50 back. What happens if we change the string entirely? What if we say 10 and IN for inches? Well, we get 10 inches back. And that's because all we're doing at this point is we're passing it as a string. And when we pass it as a string, what we're getting is we're getting back the text. We're not getting, it doesn't know that this is a number, if it's 5 millimeters or 5 inches or 5 centimeters. It just knows that this is a string of text, and that's what it's giving us back. Now, if we change the new input to a 1 and we save this, let's go back to Fusion 360 and see what that means. So get user input, I'm going to leave the default, and we get nothing. So you can see here, nothing comes back. If we try this again, and we run this, and we hit cancel, you can see nothing comes back. And again, this is because it's a mismatch of what it's expecting to see. It's not expecting to pass back that Boolean value, but it can pass the string back okay. So whenever we're working with the information that comes back from this input, we have to remember that it's not a standard string, that it's this different kind of variable that has a string and a Boolean attached to it. So what we can do is we can now use this information because we know we can pass a variable back, but now we have to really think long and hard about what that means in terms of processing any input that comes from the user. And the way that we're going to do that is with help of the units manager. So the units manager is a class that can work with the values, and it can access things like the default units, and it has all sorts of methods or functions inside of here that we can use to help us process the user's input. And when we look through this, you can see that there's information on the class type. We have a convert method, which allows us to convert from one unit to another. We have this evaluate expression, which gets the value in internal units of the expression. Now remember, internal units means centimeters. We can format the internal value. So what that allows us to do is it takes the value as a string and outputs the string format. And then we can format the units, we can check if it's a valid expression, and so on. So this is very helpful for us when we're asking the user for input, because when you have a text box and you're asking the user for, let's say, a dimension, that can be a 5, it can be a 5 mm, it can be 5 mm plus 1 inch. There's all sorts of variations of what that actually means. And unless we specifically give them a radio button or a slider that can only control a number, we really have no way of knowing what the user is going to send back. So we have to be careful with how we process and handle that information. So for the context of our examples of trying to create a script that makes user parameters, this isn't really necessary, but it is important for us to understand, again, the difference in the way that these values, these variables that we're storing information, the way in which they can differ, because that, what I found, at least in my experience so far, has been the biggest hurdle that I've had to overcome, and that's dealing with the different units or the different formats for each of these values or these variables. So inside of this units manager, the evaluate expression, when we click on it, it gives us a little bit of sample code here, how you call it. And you'll notice that we can call it from just the expression, or we can use an optional argument, which takes the expression and the units. So there's two different ways that we can use that. When we take a look down here, the return value is of type double, and it returns a -1 and gets last error. It says it will return the expression error in the event of an error. The parameters down here, we have the expression, which can be, again, 1 centimeter plus 1 inch, 3.54. It can be 0.1. It can have the units. It can just be a number. There's all these different ways in which that string can be processed. And then the units, which is, again, optional. If it's not supplied, it'll default to the default length in preferences. And this is an optional argument. So, again, we don't have to use it. But then we have a sample, and this is where we can really start to take a look. But one thing I've noticed is some samples will have C++ on the left, and some will have Python. So just make sure that you're not looking at the C++ because it's going to look foreign at this point. And the Python one will be a little bit more familiar. However, there's a lot of stuff going on in here. So first, get a string from the user, and you'll notice up here that they said is valid equal to false. And then while not is valid. So this is kind of a double negative almost. So if you say while greater than 1, and you're giving the user the ability to input a value, as long as they input a value greater than 1, it will be valid. If you say while not greater than 1, it will be valid if it's less than 1. So you have to kind of think of these as literal statements. So this while is a loop, and inside of here, all this stuff is going to happen. And then you'll notice at the very end, is valid as false is set again. But here they set a default value and input like we did. And then inside of here, they're using the UI input box, and they're getting an input from the user. But then they're using this if ret vals 0. Now remember, this is the tuple. This is the one that has that first position is the string, the text, and the second position is the Boolean, the true or false. So if we actually pass a string, which could be the default string, it could just be the 1 inch that's in there, or it could be something the user passes. If that happens, then what's going to happen down here is the input is canceled equals ret vals. So it equals the return value. And then down here, if is canceled, return. And return is basically just saying hop out. And then down here, we've got units manager, and this is the design.units manager, and then it's trying. So this is where the stuff is really going to happen. So it's going to process that value. In this case, the real value is going to be equal to evaluate expression, which is what we were looking at, input, units manager, and default lengths. So input is right here. Input is canceled is that Boolean, right? So true, false. So the input is going to equal retval. So all they're doing is they're replacing this with whatever came back from the user if the user sent something back. If the user canceled it, then it's going to skip all of this and it's going to still use input. So it's going to use whatever that default value was. So this is a case where they are doing some sort of error checking or anticipating what happens if the user did something. And then down here, what they're doing is they're sort of, they have an error expression. So if something happens, if something wrong happens, they have this UI message box. And this is telling them that the input was not valid. So the user put in something that just didn't make sense. And again, we're not really focusing on error handling, but I think what's probably best for this example is for us to copy all of this code. Now we can type it in manually or we can copy everything from here. So for us, I'm going to go ahead and type it in. If you want to copy it, then again, you can go to the sample program, use input box to get value and evaluate expression. For me, I'm going to go back to our code. And right now we have this default input. Now remember, their default input was actually just input. Our default input it has default in front of it. So obviously it's a little bit different. Then what we're going to do is we're going to start our if statements. All right, I'm going to actually come down and I'm going to put pound sign in front of that because we don't want to display it, at least not right now. And I'm going to do an if statement. Now an if is a logic statement. And basically what we're doing is we're doing conditional checking. So this conditional checking is looking at some sort of condition, whether it's a variable or a value that's greater than, equal to, less than another number, or if we're looking at user input, it's checking something for us. So you can do this with do while loops, or you can do it with if then statements. There are a couple other of these sort of logical operators or logical functions that you can use. But for our case, what we're going to do is we're going to say if, and again, that comes in red because it's a default sort of function. And it's not unique to Python. It's going to be, every language is going to have this. So if, remember we're using our new input. If new input, and we have to include those brackets because we're dealing with that tuple, and then we need to put the colon at the end of it. So if new input 0, so that means if we have something, like if there's a string that came back, if the user didn't delete it and hit OK, if we actually sent a string back, then what we want to do is inside of parentheses, we're going to say new input, comma, and then we have is canceled. So is canceled right here, and then what we're going to do is we're going to say equals new input. To make sure I spell it right. All right, so again, what's happening here is we're conditionally checking to make sure that the user sent a string back. Now, again, I've mentioned this several times. We're not really focused on error checking or handling. I think that's important, but I don't want to get too far down because it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. But we just want to make sure we understand the basics. So if I hit backspace, because again, we're looking, everything that's tabbed in under this if statement will be inside of the if statement. Then we're going to say if is canceled. So if is canceled, we're now using that here. And this if statement is going to just return. Then we're going to backspace again. And now we're going to say units mgr, which is units manager, that's the variable we're creating, is equal to the design dot units manager. Now what we're doing is we're setting up the units manager variable. We haven't used it yet, so it's still gray, but now we have this variable that is taking ownership, or it's allowing it to access the objects and the methods, the functions, all the different things that are inside of units manager. So now that we have that, what we're going to do is we're going to try. Now we're already inside of the try section, but we could add another one in here. So if we say try, again, it's going to have that tab indent. So now what we want to figure out is the real value. Because remember, we're using the units manager and evaluating the expression, and we want to pass a real value back. So what we're going to do is we're going to create we're going to say real input, and this real input is going to be equal to our units mgr, the variable that we created, dot evaluate expression. Now remember, when we evaluate the expression, we start our brackets. It tells us exactly what it's looking for, and the output is a float. So what we need first is a string, and then we have the optional argument for the units, which is also a string. So what we want to do here in this case is we want to pass it our string. So our string is going to be our default input. And actually, I see an error that we made up further in the program that we're going to have to fix. And then for the units, I'm going to put millimeters in there. I could have created a variable up here. But the error that I made in this program is that default input is 5 millimeters. And this right here, this should actually be our default input. So if we're thinking about the sample code, it was the input which was coming back from the tuple, and we want to set that to our new input. What comes back, what comes back from the user is going to override this default input, because then we can just use this default input as the value everywhere else. So now we have our real input. Now remember, this real input, this value, is what we are going to use the units manager to evaluate the expression based on our document units. And then we're going to say is valid equals true. So at this point, if we make it this far, then it's going to be a valid exception. Now, there is the except, and the except that they have in there is a UI message box. And this is probably where it's best to copy it, but I'm going to do UI.messageBox, and then we're going to send something to the user. The first bit is the string, and what they did is a single quote, and then they put a single double quote inside of it, and then they concatenated it with our default input. So default input, and then they concatenated it again with a single quote, a double quote, is not valid length. So is not a valid length. And go ahead and type expression, period, end that single quote. And then what's going to happen from here is we're going to do comma, and now we're moving on to the title. And the title is just going to be whatever you want to be at the top of the dialog box. So I'm just going to say invalid. And then what we're going to do from here is we're going to move on to the type of dialog box. Now, some of these are optional arguments. If we just pass a message box, it's going to be okay. But what they're actually doing in the sample is they're passing back a specific type of OK only button type, and then the icon that's associated with it is the critical icon type. So the way that we do this is we have to call adsk.core, and then we are calling .messagebox and the message box button types. So we hit tab to accept that, then .OK button, and again you can see that these are all coming up. OK button type, we're going to hit tab to OK that, and then comma adsk dot core dot message box icon types. So what we want to bring in is the icon types. We'll hit tab dot critical icon. So this is the one we want, and then that's going to be the end of our UI message box. Now hopefully we never see that, but we also are going to say is valid equals false. So now we have this sort of expression where we know that we're getting an input. You'll notice that real input has not been used yet. So what we need to do at this point is we need to display it somewhere. And for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the UI message box. So at this point, we also have to, again, remember that everything that's indented from this first try, you can see the arrow over here, everything that's indented from that first try is underneath it. All of this stuff is happening in here. And then this except is on its own. So this is try this. If it doesn't work, here's your exception. Pop a message box up that basically says you failed. So when we have these additional try and except inside of here, again, we need to think about the fact that if we use these arrows, anything that sort of collapses underneath it is inside of there. Now you also notice that we didn't use is valid. It's not accessed anywhere. And again, that's really used for sort of error handling. You would put some sort of condition that says if, is valid is true, is valid is false. But again, we're copying this from the sample and we're really focusing on evaluating the expression. So at this point, let's go ahead and let's figure out what we're going to send back to the user, the message box that we want. So in this case, what I'm going to do for the message box is I'm going to say input, I'm going to do colon, space, plus, and our default input. So again, that's the variable that we have that we set for 5 millimeters, but we asked the user if they wanted to change it. Plus, again, we're concatenating, we're putting all these things together, and we're going to do a space result, and put a space there. And we're going to do a plus, and we're going to try to use the real value. Okay, so the real value or the real input that we got back, we haven't used that yet. We're going to try to use that, and then we're going to save this and we're going to try to run it. Now, I have a pretty good feeling that this is not going to work, and we're going to have to do some checking. But let's go ahead and try API get input up. So 5 millimeters, I'm going to change it to 50, say OK, and now we have an issue. So here it's telling us on line 28, input, it's in the message box, so it's at the very end of our program. It's telling us that type error can only concatenate string, not float to string. So what this is telling me is that the item type I'm trying to pass, this real input, after it goes through evaluate expression, what I'm getting back is actually a number. You can see when you hover your cursor over it, it shows you that it's a float. Where over here, this is a string, and these are obviously all strings. We type those in inside quotes. So string, string, string are all fine, but this is a number. This is a float. So the way that we handle this, and we already did this in our very first video, our first example, is we use the str. The str is object function that's built into Python that lets us convert whatever inside here to a string. So let's save it and let's try this again. So back in Fusion, we're going to go to our add-ins, get user input. We'll set this to 500 millimeters, something different. We're going to say OK. Input 500 millimeters, result 50. So what does that really mean when we have that result is 50? So if we look back at our code, we have our input value is the default input. Now, right now it's set to 5, but we actually put 500. So that changed, which shows us that this part is working. It shows us that it took the tuple, which is the ID 0 in the variables that are filling new input, and it replaced the default input, which was 5, with our 500. Now we sent that down into our units manager. We told it that the units were millimeters. So what it did was it took that 500 and it turned it into that float, that actual number. But this real input value that we got back is 50. And the reason it's 50 is because Fusion operates in centimeters. So even though we put the number in as 500 millimeters, we have to pass back the number 50 in order for it to be the right units when it gets back into Fusion. So if we pass the real input back to Fusion, we'll get 500 millimeters as our user parameter. I know it's a little bit tough to think about this, but doing a little bit of testing and passing some additional numbers will help. So if we go to the add-ins, we run this again, let's put in an inch value. So let's say 1 space inch, and let's see if this works. We'll say OK. Input is 1 inch. The result is 2.54 centimeters. Now remember that this real input, this value, is what we're going to put back into Fusion, and then the document units, which are metric, will automatically convert it. So It takes a little bit of work. Obviously, we're not quite there yet because we still need to create a user parameter, but it takes a little bit of work to get through something like this. And while we didn't use this is valid true, is valid false, we haven't tried to send it anything that's not a valid input. Everything that we've done to this point has really been looking at getting something from the user using this input box. It's saying that the default value is this 5mm. Remember, it's a string. It's in quotes. It's a string. It's passing the number and the units as just text characters. And what it's saying is this is the default value. If the user inputs something different, then what we're going to do is we're going to replace default input with the new input. If it's canceled, then we'll return and we'll hop out of this loop here. Then we're going to call our variable units mgr. We're going to set it to our units manager. From there, we can then use things like evaluate expression, where it takes a string, evaluated the number, it takes a string for the units, and it converts it to a float. We're going to get an actual number out of it. From there, the actual number, if we want to just display it in a message box, needs to be converted to a string. Now, we could certainly come back and we could say UI.messageBox and just display the real input. And that's fine because we're not trying to concatenate it with other strings. This would just spit out the number. But remember that this is a float. It's a float, which means that it's not quite ready for us to go into using it in a user parameter. We still need to go back and use things like the value input and create by real. At this stage, I'm going to save this program. I think that's a good place for us to stop since it's already been 30 minutes. And in the next video, we're going to take the user input and we're going to put it into, in this case, we're going to put it into the user parameter. So what we can do is we can ask the user to input text, the name of a user parameter, and then we can also prompt them to give us an input value. So the text, we don't have to go through all this unit manager, evaluate expression, whatever. All we need to do is call the return of the input box using the brackets and the 0 because that's the string we want. We can call that and we can use that as the name of our new user parameter. But with the actual dimensions, we need to run it through this units manager. We need to evaluate it, allow it to do all the conversion for us. We'll tell it the units we want. And then from there, we need to run it through that, the option where we use the create by real. So the create by real will then take that float, turn it into what we need for our new user parameter.add, and then we'll be able to get it all done. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, all of this code, we could have just hard coded these in. And yes, that's 100% true. This is overkill, but this is also the next step in working with API is interacting with the user. Because user inputs, at least at the very basic level, the input box, is the first way that you're going to ask the user for something, whether it's a value, a string, an OK, or a cancel. And then from there, you can interact with the user. So make sure that at this point you play around, try to understand at the very least the input box, the fact that we're getting back a string in that first position. And if we were not concerned with the user inputting something incorrectly, then we can skip all of this. We could just say that the new input 0 is what we're going to use in this evaluate expression. And then that's going to in turn get used in the create by real and downstream and so on. But just keep in mind that with this example, we do have a little bit of error handling, and we can deal with the fact that we're going to replace the default input with our new input, and then we're going to move that on through the process of converting it and playing with it. So at this stage, go ahead and save what you've done, look through the code, try to make sure that you understand it. In the next example, I think we're going to carry on with this code and not replicate it. Obviously, on the simple examples, if we're just adding a user parameter or creating a variable, it's much easier. I don't think it's worth the hassle to try to go back through all this again, unless we do it without all the error handling. So I'll give that a little bit of thought, decide what I want to do there. But if you have any questions, obviously let me know. And then thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.